This is Elizabeth Clare Brewington with Discover Brightside, where we discover new speakers for your next event. And perhaps you are thinking about using LARP for your next training program. So I have a very esteemed panel, and we're going to discuss everything that you need to know for your next training or conference or event that you're planning with learning more about LARP and organization. And I have an expert with me, Stephen, and Steven's going to give us a brief background about his books. And he's been in this industry for some time now. And so if you have a question and you're watching this on Facebook or LinkedIn or anywhere that this broadcast is featured, write us a comment and I'll make sure that the panel gives you an answer. So thank you for watching and over to you.
What if your next leadership breakthrough didn't come from a strategy deck, but from stepping into a story? I'm Dr. Stephen Balzac. I'm an organizational psychologist and one of the world's experts in the design of live-action role-playing games, living stories for team building and leadership development. I've been developing LARPs for over 40 years since my freshman year at MIT. Thanks to my background, I was invited to appear in Under the Monopoly Story, where I was personally panned by a New York Times movie critic. But why do we care about story? Stories are fun, but what can they really do for us? Well, once upon a time, 8 elderly men suddenly grew 20 years younger. This wasn't magic or the fountain of youth. It was psychologist Ellen Langer's 1979 counterclockwise study, in which elderly men spent a week in a cabin designed to reproduce the world of 1959. Period newspapers, books, radio shows were all part of the scenery, helping reinforce the role play. Over the course of the study, the men appeared to become younger. Their arthritis symptoms decreased, their hearing, memory, and physical capabilities improved. By the end of the study, men who could barely walk across a room at the beginning were playing touch football with the grad students. I mean, they weren't going and tackling each other, they were still in their late 70s. But the fact that they could run where 2 weeks before they could barely walk, they had spent 2 weeks role-playing a story set in a time when they were younger. Their bodies and minds followed along. And that's the thing, stories matter, but not just any stories, not just the right stories, not just the stories that we hear, but the stories that we live. They shape how we organize information, how we think, how we experience the world. They imbue us with new skills. They make us more capable. When we live stories together, when we experience one another's stories, then those stories build a connection. They bring us together. Did we grow up in the same town, go to the same school, attend the same college, play the same sports, or just play sports at all? The more experiences we share, the more stories we share. The more stories we share, and the more intense those stories, the more we become part of each other's stories. Organizations come together around story. Organizations are grouped with a purpose, and that purpose is expressed and lived through story. The story the organization tells about itself, its reason for being. That's its core story. But the stories shared by members of the organization, especially their shared backstories, form the fabric of the organizational culture. Without shared story, culture is less cohesive, less unified, more fragile. There's no foundation. But story is more than just a passive experience. The story that we're immersed in, the story that we are experiencing, shapes our reality. The stories that we live make us better leaders, better innovators, and better decision makers. They teach us when to be confident and when to be humble. They give us perspective. And that's where live-action role-playing games, or LARPs, come in. LARP illuminates reality through lived fiction, showing the truths we so easily miss. In a LARP, you don't just learn about leadership, teamwork, or decision-making under pressure. You live it. You experience it, and you learn from it. Because you can learn a lot from trying to save the world, or destroy it, from trying to take control of the flying city of Atlantis, or dramatically going down in flames. Is it fantasy? Of course it's a fantasy. And that fantasy can teach us a lot about how to be successful and how to make our businesses successful. Imagine for a moment you're in an auditorium or a conference room, a large conference. Lots of people, usually dressed in impressive government issue business suits. Senior leaders, smart people, confident people. And then suddenly everyone's phone starts beeping and pinging. Alerts are coming in. A flight just landed. Passengers are getting sick. There were no symptoms before landing, and now it's spreading. Phones are buzzing. There are conflicting reports. No one has the full picture. Someone says we need to shut down travel. Someone else says that will destroy the economy. Someone says wait for more data. Someone else says if we wait, it's too late. And now everyone is looking at you. What do you do? Now pause that moment and just think about it. Because what I just described, what you just saw in your mind, is exactly what happens inside organizations every single day. Not the virus part, or at least hopefully not more than once in 100 years, but the decision part, the incomplete information, the conflicting incentives, the pressure, the feeling that time is running out. And here's the problem. We never train for that. Because let's face it, the thing that gets left out of emergency training is the emergency. Now, here's the twist, though. That scenario I just described, it wasn't real, as much as it may have sounded familiar. It was a LARP. It was a live immersive simulation, a living story that I designed and ran long before COVID ever showed up. I ran this in 2000s, originally ran this, but the behavior, completely real. Because under pressure, people do what is natural for them to do and play out the story they're in. There's a reason athletes practice performing under pressure and tell stories about overcoming the competition, especially stories about coming up from behind. There's a reason actors spend weeks rehearsing a performance in order to bring a story to life. We do what we practice, and we have to practice until the behavior becomes natural, until the cues fit together, until we sync up with our team. Story, living story, is a key part of how we practice. The stories we create, the stories we live, tell us how things are going, guide our expectations, focus our attention, and create meaning. We think in narrative. We organize experience in narrative. Someone asks you, how did your day go? What happens? You organize everything into a story, into a cause and effect narrative. We explore alternative ideas and possibilities through narrative. The stories we inhabit shape our perception, our behavior, even our physiology, as the counterclockwise study demonstrated to dramatic effect. Stories tell us what to look for, what's important, and what helps us succeed. Story creates and shapes our reality. Organizations are no different. They're living stories woven from shared goals, shared history, shared struggle. When the story is fragmented, culture fractures. When people lack shared stories, teams turn into silos. But when the story is vivid and shared, teams come together to become more than just the sum of their parts. Live action role-playing, LARP, is applied organizational psychology. It is immersive simulation for leadership development, team performance, strategic decision-making, and cultural transformation. Inside a well-designed, plot-driven LARP, goals collide. Information is incomplete. Incentives compete. Power dynamics surface. Under pressure, real behavior appears. Strategy turns from abstraction to lived experience, all within the framework of a story that matters. Because when we play the roles of people for whom the story matters, we feel the pressure, the adrenaline, the intensity. Research in goal-setting theory, motivation science, experiential learning, and cognitive bias all converge on the same conclusion. The skills practiced under emotionally meaningful conditions stick. Shared stories create shared social reality. And social reality drives meaning, engagement, and performance. It builds our collaboration muscles, our creative muscles, and our decision-making muscles. And those are the three muscles that every organization depends on to be successful. Organizations stagnate when their story calcifies, when urgency crowds out curiosity, when past success becomes dogma, when collaboration, creativity, and decision-making are allowed to atrophy. They thrive when they continually bring people into new stories and renew old ones. At one organization I worked at, they talked all about how the whole company went to the Galapagos Islands. It was a great story. But as the years passed, it became a story about what we did and you didn't, because they never again did that type of company activity that brought the whole company together into one place. So they had a story, and the story calcified. It became us and them instead of all about us as a team. LARP is a space where organizations can create their new stories and revitalize their old ones. But there's more, because LARP doesn't just stand for live action role playing. It also describes exactly what people walk away with every time. LARP, L-A-R-P, leadership, alignment, role, perspective. And when you have leadership, alignment, role, and perspective, you also get strategy. You build the muscles that keep your organization vibrant, alive, and competitive. The muscles that power effective strategy. Leadership. Who actually steps up when it matters? Not who has the title. Who stands up? Who fills the role? Businesses are full of people who hold titles but who never step up or who freeze when the hard decisions arrive. Alignment, where people are pulling together and where they're pulling apart, because where they're in sync and where they're acting across purposes, not because they intend to act across purposes, but because they haven't trained to work together. Because agreement isn't alignment. Agreement is just nodding along. Alignment is when we're speaking the same language. Role. Who understands what they're responsible for and who doesn't? Who jumps in the wrong place and gets in the way? Who quietly supports their teammates and makes sure the job gets done? Who absorbs the strengths of the role they're playing? Who turns the role into a relationship and builds the team? Perspective. Who sees the whole system, the big picture, and who's trapped in their silo? Who is open to new information, and who denies anything that doesn't fit their preconceptions or which threatens their self-interest? And then finally, strategy. What actually works once reality gets to have a vote? Because effective strategy is always changing, always responding to what is happening around you. If you don't have strong leadership, if you have poor alignment, misunderstood roles, and a lack of perspective, then what you get is still strategy. It's just bad strategy. Strategy that fails when things don't go as expected. Strategy that tries to do too much with too few resources. Strategy that tries to do everything instead of focusing on what matters. And you can't fake any of that in a simulation like this. It shows up fast. In one LARP session, everything was under control until the first person died in the simulation, and you could feel the room change. It became real. Tension spiked. Decisions got sharper and more difficult. People stopped talking in theory and started making real trade-offs. The conversation literally went from, my character would do this, to, I'm making this decision now because we're out of time. There was just a complete mental shift in this group of business people who thought that this was a pointless exercise up until someone was eliminated from it. At a different company, decades of success left them confident, too confident. They were on top of the world and saw no reason to change anything. Then things got difficult. Leadership froze. A deer in the headlights shows more initiative. Was rejected, and they paid the price. You've probably seen that happen at least a few times. In another LARP session, the group's strategy appeared flawless until a key player was eliminated, and they didn't adjust. When we debriefed at the end, they recognized that the behavior they had just seen in miniature in a game was happening every day at their office. Strategy had become sacred, rigid, and unchanging. They weren't adapting to new information. They were ignoring it. Now they could see what was happening and they could change it before it burned them. That's learning. That's change that sticks. Because in your organization, those moments are real. They happen. You just don't know when, other than never when it's convenient. The first time your team experiences them should not be when the stakes are real, when every decision feels momentous, when leadership isn't prepared, and it shows. Because when leadership is paralyzed, so is everyone else. Because here's the truth. You don't rise to the occasion. You fall to your level of practice. Most companies try to teach leadership separately. They try to do alignment separately. They talk about strategy in slides, as though it were a magic formula or an inevitable destiny. But in reality, it all happens at once, under pressure, inside a system. LARP lets you rehearse that system. It lets your team experience the hard moments before they happen in real life. So when they do, they've been there before. They know how to adapt, how to adjust, how to navigate chaos successfully. Because LARP isn't just something you do, it's what you get. Leadership, alignment, role, perspective, strategy. And once you've seen those clearly, you can finally start to change them successfully. Because if you want your team to perform differently under pressure, you have to give them a chance to practice differently, to experience what it's like to be bolder, more insightful, more strategic. Because when you role play being bolder, more insightful, more strategic under pressure, your mind and your body will follow along. Just as, once upon a time, 8 men role playing a story set in a time when they were younger found their bodies and minds following along. The LARP effect is about building optimistic, resilient, high-performing organizations by intentionally designing the stories people live at work. It's about competitive advantage forged through shared experience. It's about leadership that is practiced, not preached. And above all, it's about creating connection between people, the sort of connections that build teams, break silos, and lead to winning strategies. Business is already a game. Let's play it with purpose. Thank you.
Oh, that was fantastic. I learned a lot. Any questions before we move to the fireside chat? All right. So we're going to introduce each of you now to the panel discussion, and I would start with Stephen, if you would like to introduce yourself, and then Joe, and then Andy, and then we'll go into the discussion.
I'm Steve Balzac. I'm an organizational psychologist, originally a computer scientist, and I've been designing LARP since the early 1980s. I'm the founder of the MIT Assassins Guild, which is still around today and still running live role-playing games. I'm the author of 3 books, which you can see up behind me, on organizational development, organizational psychology for managers, and the new book, The LARP Effect, which should be dropping any day now from Springer. And I've been working in tech as an engineer, manager, and a consultant for most of the past 40 years.
Okay, wonderful. I will make sure that it's also available at the Brightside Marketplace, and you will have the links as soon as Springer drops it. So we'll make sure that you know about where to get the book from. And if you book Stephen, you can get the books as part of his presentation as well. So we'll make sure that information is available to you. So over to you, Joe. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes. Hello. My name is Dr. Joe Lasley. I'm an associate professor of leadership and organizational studies at the University of Southern Maine and the CEO of Gamnamic Leadership, which is a consulting and research firm that I developed along with teaching org development, leadership development, group dynamics, systems thinking topics. I research and develop and use tabletop role-playing games for leadership development and group dynamics, so that you can find me in all of those places.
Oh, that's fantastic. All right. What about you, Andy?
Hi, I'm Andy Ellis. I've actually been playing LARP and writing games for the MIT Assassins Guild actually since the late 1980s. So I came a little bit after Steve, so I'm very thankful that he'd helped build it. Computer, scientist by heart, spent a lot of time in the cybersecurity world. I now advise cybersecurity companies on organizational dynamics and go-to-market strategy. I'm the author of 1% Leadership, as well as the editor of howtociso.com.
So there we have it. We have a group of experts. And so my first question to each of you, and I think Stephen touched upon it in his keynote, is what is LARP and why should organizations adopt it in their training programs? So anyone can go first. We're not going to have any.
So I'll actually jump into this one because in cybersecurity, we use LARPing a lot, and people say you should run a tabletop. Right. And the difference between a tabletop role-playing exercise and a live action role-playing exercise is really the separation between yourself and the role. And if you watch Steve's keynote, you really you got that. And one of the things that we found when we were doing tabletop incidents is that people didn't do believable things. Right? They said, oh, well, I will go do this and it will be easy. And once we got people out of that, sort of put you into this hallucination that you are really in an incident, that all of a sudden people made different choices, and those choices actually reflected the experience that we had looking historically. We said, oh, that is actually how you behave in an incident. And so now the organization starts to learn and adapt, and it would give us the opportunity for people to sort of exercise themselves. And if you're familiar with the bystander effect, if you're not, very briefly, when something bad happens, people will stand around and be like, what do I do? Even if they have useful skills. And LARP helps you break past that bystander effect by immersing you in when it's not life-threatening, when it's not critical, and you get practice that this thing happens and I go do X. So when something happens, you're used to doing a thing. And in most cases, that's going to be very helpful.
And I do.
Oh, you just froze on that one. I was worried it was me, but I saw Steve was moving as well. So I think that was your freezing.
Yeah, I've got a follow-up question. But Joe, define for us LARP.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about how useful a textbook definition would be, than kind of maybe a way of thinking about what is this thing. It's kind of how I'll approach the answer here. It's similar for me in tabletop role-playing games, which are different than tabletop exercises too. And what I've found to be similar between LARPs and tabletop role-playing games is also the way I approach leadership. It's a part of the human experience. And so there's this phenomenon of people coming together, and there are group dynamics happening, there are individual experiences happening there. Because it's a group, there are functions of a group like leadership that need to be fulfilled, and people take on roles, and we do some of that intentionally through characters that we might take on, or stories or premises that we have to play with, and of course we do it with a sense of play. So what we're doing when we're doing LARP or tabletop role playing is we're doing the same human experience, but we're adding some intention to how we're creating that experience. And so we get multiple levels of being able to tell a story and then also share in the experience of that story in the way that we interact as a group, which is also just kind of a normal group human thing. So I think, Steve did an excellent job of pointing out things like decision making and rehearsal that we get to do. But I think the aspects, the human experience of telling a story, taking on roles and characters, and fulfilling the functions of a group are all, I think, key components of what is a LARP.
Well, I would add to all of this, which is all excellent points, that storytelling has been sort of the fundamental way that humans have transmitted information and learning from generation to generation for as long as we've been human. It's how we encapsulate what is good and what is bad. If you look at the structure of a story, of old like mythological stories, heroes are people who sacrifice themselves for the greater good. Villains are people who hoard the resources and keep the resources away from the rest of the tribe. And this goes back, some estimates say, 50,000, 100,000 years or more. it's very fundamental. The other thing that we do again as humans is we play make believe.
Hmm.
We enact our stories. We've all played cops and robbers and games like that as kids, or Sith these days. I think they're playing Sith and Jedi, but it's the same basic idea. We're playing these games because playing these games as children let us learn important skills for adult life. Sometimes those skills may be less relevant, like hide and seek, which is, if you think about it, a game teaching children how to spot the predator hidden in the underbrush. Maybe a little less relevant today when we're not worrying about having a lion jump out at us.
I don't know. We
But
got coyotes in my neighborhood.
yeah, so you never know. Could be a roadrunner too.
Yeah.
But so what a LARP is make believe for grown-ups. It's taking this same concept and putting it at a level of sophistication that an adult mind can enjoy. It's not too simple. It's not something obvious where we know exactly what to do. And that puts us in a space where we can learn and we can experiment, we can try things. And then afterward, we can talk about it and say, what worked? What didn't work? And let's face it, what is discussing all these alternate outcomes of a story? Well, that's just like doing a project post-mortem, except it's a lot more fun when it's a story.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the after stories are some of the best. I think another key thing that LARP provides that tabletop does not, and that is really important, is this concept of not being on the rails. And if anybody's ever, played a video game, you sometimes feel like you're sort of on the rails that the game designer created for you. There is only one path forward. And when you're sitting around a table doing an incident or doing a role-playing game, you get sort of that same effect, which is the game master really is in charge. And in live action, you lose that because every person is off doing whatever they want to do. There's side conversations that there is no one watching. And so there are no rails, and you get much more of this open world reality, which is what our normal reality is. And so when you're trying to understand how organizations will behave, you're going to get much closer to that in LARP, where, you decide to do a thing and 7 other people are scheming to do something else out of your line of sight. And that's really important for understanding what's really going to happen when you're actually in a crisis or actually need to develop what's in a later place.
Well, I will say, oddly enough, maybe coming from me, having done both a lot of tabletop and live role playing, tabletop can be really good for developing social connection.
Yes.
Because it provides you with a moderating space where you can the thief can pick the pocket of the party, and then the people can sort of argue that through. And so it has an important role in this.
Absolutely.
And it's just the more physical components we add, sort of the more we engage the body, the more we engage the mind. And that helps people really experience the stress of, wait a minute, I can be eliminated from this exercise. I can die. And that makes it real in a just a deep, visceral way.
In fact, I will say that when my team ran our LARP incidents for, various form of, we're going to try out a crisis this year, I would always volunteer. I'm like, I will happily die. I mean, I'm on vacation. That's usually what it was, because what an important component is, you got to try things that aren't well scripted. And so everyone would go in and like, oh yeah, we have access to Andy. He's going to be, the incident commander. And then as soon as the incident happens, they're like, oh, by the way, Andy has no cell phone coverage. We don't know where he is. Brian, you're now in charge. And everybody has to react to that. And it's sort of this fascinating thing. And people are looking at me going, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm headed to lunch. Have a nice time, y'all.
Yeah, well, I think I want to point out the difference between tabletop exercise and tabletop role-playing game, because I do think that tabletop role-playing games, and this is really crucial, how they're facilitated can be just as off the rails as a LARP.
Yes.
And that's the meaningful difference is, are we doing role-playing storytelling, or are we doing a scripted exercise, or even in a lot of leadership trainings who say, okay, now it's time for the role play. Here's your script, play this part. And everyone just cringes. And I do too, because that's not the role-playing that I am doing, where it's even in a sitting around a table exercise, embodying a character, at least in mindset and social interaction. And then the real differentiator is that way of practicing and having it be embodied
Yes.
by getting up and moving around.
Yeah. And I've certainly found that people who had written LARPs, when they came into my organization, because I did hire very heavily out of MIT as well, and they had this range of skill sets because they're used to dealing with these. Not only were they LARP players, but they had to deal with so many of them and had to plan for contingencies of, well, what happens when my players go off the rails and do this? Because in a tabletop, you can let your players off the rails, but you get to watch it. In a LARP, you have to predict the ways they're going to go off the rails and leave ways for the game to adapt when you're not physically present. And that makes you really good at building sort of safe plans for the future when you get into business.
Well, one of my some of my clients and participants talk about this like aspect of leading an organization that is mirrored really well and particularly in a LARP, but also in a well facilitated role-playing game is you don't get to be everywhere all at once. Other things are going on, other people are actors in the story. You do need a story to tell, but you don't have all of the say and you don't predict everything that's going to happen. You just have to prepare for whatever to happen and still have a story to tell.
Now, one of the I'm sorry, Joe, did you freeze?
No, go for it. I could go on and on. We've got plenty of time to talk. Let's have a conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, no, at first I thought you had ended and then it looked like you had frozen. So, okay, I think one of the really important points here is how real can you make the role play feel? Mm-hmm. And what really brought this home to me was actually when my wife was pursuing her PhD or study in clinical psychology. And they would have to do these role plays where one student would be the psychologist, the other would be the patient, the client, and they'd roll through. And my wife found these incredibly uncomfortable. And I said to her, why is this uncomfortable? You've been doing role play for 30 years. You were with me at the founding the Assassin's Guild. Mm-hmm. How did and we worked it through, and what it came out was it felt artificial. There were no goals, there was no structure, there was no reason. And then as I started to dig into the research on it, I found that when you do those same role plays, but the person playing the patient is a theater student, suddenly the quality goes way up because the theater student may not have specific goals as the person coming in, but they know how to act the role. Well, what we're doing with a good tabletop game or a good LARP is we're creating a goal structure, and that goal structure sets up the reality that makes people engage.
Yes.
It also teaches you, frankly, how much your organization is probably not setting up a good goal structure. Because if people aren't engaging, it's often because the goals really are that vague.
Well, and I think a really fascinating affordance in doing a LARP as an organizational development practice, and it also could serve as an organizational practice in and of itself, is that to do a LARP, you have to have the story, the people who understand the world that we're building and how we're building it. And then you also have to have people who understand the game that we're playing and how we're playing it. Mm-hmm. And in an organization, there's the people who are like, here are the metrics that we need to measure, and here's the culture and strategy that we need to cultivate. And those are the exact same kinds of processes that are happening. People who understand the system and the day-to-day results and getting people to do that, or at least being able to facilitate a whole bunch of players engaging in both of those things.
And one of the things you get to observe when you're LARPing with people that who might be work colleagues in this case, is you get to see how they behave in a system that doesn't have sort of the same high stakes as the workplace. And it might help you understand their reality and their dynamics. And you just mentioned, Joe, you have these metrics in play. I've mostly found that most companies have really bad metrics and they don't understand why people are acting the way they do. They're like, well, we have metrics to measure the right outcomes. The answer is you don't. And when you start playing a game where there's different metrics and you're like, those are stupid metrics. And they're like, but these people are doing the same things in this game world that they do in reality. Maybe it might open your eyes to the fact that the metrics you love aren't as valuable to everybody else in this world, because you're watching people break the system, in the LARP, and then you realize they're actually working to break your system too, because it's not beneficial. And so it helps you reverse engineer sort of human behavior by looking at that same personality. Because much as we like it, we try to get into character, but it's still usually us and, you know, our reality underneath it. So you get to see that reality in a more artificial situation. It might give you some sort of compassion and empathy, and more importantly, some understanding for what motivates someone.
I think it's exactly because we're not trained actors that this works.
Right.
Because a trained actor is taught how to go up there and portray wildly different characters. I mean, you look at someone like David Tennant, who is, you know, plays the Doctor on Doctor Who, and plays a villain in one of the Marvel TV shows. And, you know, it's hard to get more diametrically opposite than these two roles that he plays, because that's his job. But most of us, we're not trying to get up there in a LARP and be an actor. We're just trying to play the role. And playing the role, fundamentally, just as in business, is really playing a goal. I mean, if you're not going for a goal, you're cosplay. And cosplay can be fun, but goals are what makes it real. Because, you know, you're a physicist because you're doing physics. You're an economist because you're doing economics. Not because you walk around, in the case of a physicist, in a lab coat or whatever. Yeah. And so I think this is a big part of creating this reality and letting people be who they are. And we get to see how you do accomplish goals. How do you work with other people in these ambiguous, time-compressed scenarios? And actually, to Andy's point about doing it with coworkers, what really made the difference for me between this as LARP as entertainment and the beginning realization that LARP could be a serious tool was running a game. This was about 25 years ago, actually, running a game out in California, and a lot of coworkers of mine came to play it. It was Secrets of the Necronomicon. It's a 60-player, weekend-long Lovecraft game. A whole lot of coworkers of mine decided to come play. And I started to realize I could see the behavior all compressed into the weekend that I was actually seeing over months in the office, but I hadn't recognized it because it was too spread out. But now that it was compressed, it's like, that's what's going on. That's why these two groups aren't talking to each other. That's why we can't seem to get past this particular problem. And it was really incredibly insightful moment.
Well, back to also what Andy was saying about these aha moments, about seeing your coworkers or people you know play in these different scenarios. The very fact that we're doing a role-playing game means like two things at once. It is a fiction, right? We've put boundaries of play around what we're doing and time and play, right? Like it's this weekend or whatever, and it's this role, and it's not the organizational role that I have, and I'm going to play a character. So there's a fiction there, and we have a real experience of playing it at the same time, which, especially when it's very embodied, and for non-trained actors, but maybe even some actors, it can be this is a personal development thing with a little bit more distance because it's also a fiction. And even the excitement or the feeling of insight or aha in recognizing those moments, that in itself is a key leadership development outcome of metacognition, of now all of a sudden you can see things because you had this particular experience that bridged the real, like, in-depth experience with a total fiction. And now you're in the middle and you can start to learn how to see in that way. And then you notice all kinds of stuff.
Yeah. I just want to say Steve has settled an argument that was long running in the Assassin's Guild, especially in the 90s. Lots of people were saying, you know, are you here to play a role or to play to win? And I would joke it's role play to win, but Steve just said you're here for the goal. So he settled the argument. So I wish I could take that clip, send it back 30 years to everybody who disagreed with me, because I was a firm believer that you play your role to win the game. Like your goal, you have some goals, you're out to achieve them. Sometimes your goals are very weird and obscure and nobody else thinks you've won, but you do. But thank you, Steve, for settling that one.
Well, you're welcome. And I will say I said this in the 1990s too, and no one listened to me.
Nobody was listening to then, but maybe we can, get it back.
But I mean, this is, let me just quickly make this point of in story, just in a standard piece of fiction, the difference between a character that looks flat and a character that looks three-dimensional is whether that character has a goal.
Yeah.
That simple.
Yeah.
And that difficult.
Well, I'm just going to say that this debate about, what do you play to role play or you play to win reminds me of a debate that is still active. And there's research on this that are you in character or out of character? And where is the difference between those two things? And the misnomer is that there's a discrete and universal difference between those two things. The research is very clear that all participants have an experience of this is me, this is my character, and there's interactions between all of that. And it's also very clear that nobody agrees on where that is. So we all agree that there's a player versus character, but nobody knows exactly where it is, but we all think we know exactly where it is. And therein of itself lies the opportunity.
Yeah, I usually found that the people who would argue that you were trying to play the role, that you should play the role more than you should play to win, were people who did not know what their own goals were and were being frustrated by everybody else achieving theirs.
Well, I think they just had different goals. Maybe they had process-oriented goals.
I've played games where I had the process-oriented goal. Like I wasn't trying to win a thing. I was trying to corral people, etc. But to me, that was my goal.
Yeah, but we assume that everybody needs to have the same orientation to goal.
Yeah. If you have the same orientation, why are you live action role playing? Like that's a tabletop. If we're competing over the same thing, that's a board game.
Yeah.
Like what makes LARP great is we're not.
The compartmentalization's in our head. It's not out in the world.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Some of this is building on the research on anonymity. When we feel anonymous, as we know, people typically behave in a less moral fashion when they feel anonymous. But what a LARP is doing is not making you anonymous exactly. It's giving you a mask and expectations of who you are when you're wearing that mask. And so you've just stepped into a social framework. Same thing with tabletop. You're wearing a mask and a social framework that comes with the mask. Yep. And so to a certain extent, our ability to then play that, and yes, there is a separation between us.
You froze.
And that, in fact, is vital to learning because it gives us the chance to accept our mistakes without feeling that it's personally attacking our sense of self. And it gives us a chance to experiment and be able to say, yeah, I was my character. But we do need that separation. And yeah, we could spend gallons of printer toner arguing about exactly where that line is. The important thing, I think, is that, yes, there is a line, and that line is important.
Well, it's a blurry line. And the practice is having to discern where it is. And that is a leadership practice, just like decision-making or storytelling, that actually knowing who am I and what is my role and how am I in this role, that whole process of role-playing plays out in organizations just the same. It's a leadership practice in and of itself.
Yeah. And one of the leadership practices that I took, this was late in the 90s, somebody wrote up rules for LARP writers. People who are going to write Assassin's games. And he had 4 rules, and I only remember 3 of them right now, so I'll apologize for not remembering the 4th. But he named them all after a player in the guild at the time. And he basically said, these are the players who will break your game because you don't plan around them correctly. Right. And one of the players was the person who would basically say, you've created this economic game and like there's this LARP around the economics. And you think that it's an unsolvable game, but it's solvable. Like linear algebra will solve the problem. I will go ask everybody what they want and what they have, and then I will just solve the math. And we get rid of the whole LARP aspect of people needing conflicting things when it turns out everybody can win. And so basically one of the rules is if you would like there to be tension in your economy, then you must make your economy unsolvable. If like there is a perfect solution, you will have a player go solve it for you, right? So here's this rule for you. There was a rule that was never underestimate a player's athleticism. That there are players who will throw their bodies at things and who are athletes. Like you don't think of an MIT computer science folks as being nerds, but we had ROTC students who were playing. We had people who were athletes who could outplay other players just physically. And so never write a thing where you don't expect, somebody to leap out of the side of a parking garage. And I think Steve knows exactly who I'm talking about on that one.
I did a few of those things myself.
You may have, but there's the story is a very specific person who did that one. But I myself have done those. Another one which is never have a vague rule, because there are players who will take your vague rules and be like, oh, I can interpret it this way and run with it. And what makes that really helpful that LARP sort of gives you is we expect certain societal norms. Like people don't normally break the rules in our corporations. But when you're playing games, people break rules all the time, especially if they can justify it. And what it sort of really then helps you do is understand that when you are the rule maker, which I was as a chief security officer, I was in charge of writing the rules for everybody. And I will tell you the number of executives I frustrated because I refused to write rules that would violate these principles that I had of like, don't write rules that players will try to cheat. Like you don't write a rule until everybody already follows the rule. Then you write the new rule, or it's got to be an obvious rule that everybody will agree with. And it's one of the things that I just love about like people who write LARPs actually are really defensive writers, right? They're fighting every single player in their head when they're writing it. And that is such a profound and amazing skill. And I think I came back to it a couple times, but to me, that's one of the most powerful things of LARP is once it's fun to play them, but it's so powerful to get to write them and to learn how to do these mechanics.
One of the things I'll say, actually, to disagree slightly, is people in organizations break rules all the time.
Yes.
When the rules are unclear or when the rules get in the way of them, and there's a constant game going on, almost literally game of, well, let's see, I have this objective. If I break these rules, I can accomplish it. And you know what? If I'm successful, no one's going to care.
Right.
And in fact, it's the organizations that lack that structure. I mean, they should have better rules. But at the same time, I've also seen organizations that lack even that structure. And in some ways, it's worse. I described one company I was at as like pushing on fog. Everyone was like, oh, that's a great idea. Go ahead and do it. But then, you try to make something happen and, oh, yeah, that's great. Well, so-and-so, it's like an episode of MASH where they needed to get each group to agree to something and then the whole swap could happen. And because there was no structure and no rules, everyone was waiting for someone else to move. Right. It was absolutely madness.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've got a beef with the rules. That's just kind of me and how I've always shown up. But I realized in my research that has now become a key part of the leadership development practice using role-playing games. And I'll say analog role-playing games, because that's the thing I'm getting at here is, I've always been I'll break the rules like kind of person, an innovator, a troublemaker, that kind of a person. The rules are meant to be bent. I just found satisfaction in trying to find the limits of the rules. Like, where is the fog? What will people actually tolerate versus what they say? All of these kinds of things. And I realized in doing the research on the leadership experience of role-playing games that the key difference in an analog role-playing game versus a digital role-playing game is that the rules are made up by us. And it just so happens that's also what I believe about organizations, which happens to be true, it's not as simple as I'm saying it in reality. Like there are really important rules that exist and they're much harder to break and just rewrite them than in a role-playing game. But organizations by nature are made up by human beings. They're not, we don't always know that we're making them the way that they are, which is what causes all the problems in organizations. But ultimately, we have agency. And even when I'm playing just a game for fun, and my players say, well, the rule says that I can't do this. And I say, but it would make such a great story. What if we just did it this time? And we agreed because the rule is between us. We made the rule, we changed the rule, we are the rule. Like they give us an objective system to follow to help structure ourselves as a social group, but also they're all made up. And if we could just realize that about organizations, then we'd maybe stop getting in our own way.
Well, that's a really critical point, Joe, which is the rules in an organization aren't made up from the top even. They're made up point in time as people go on. And one of my favorite examples, and I like to tell people, you have to sort of keep your hand on the wheel to know where your organization's going, or else the invisible gorilla is just going to run all over your organization. And here's the thing that happens, and everybody has probably seen this. A senior executive gets up at an all hands or whatever and says, look, employee wellness is really important. All of you need to take your vacation time and take time away from work to really, compose yourself so that when you're present, you're all here, right? We've all heard that. That's a rule that's literally just been said, usually by the CEO. Then, of course, the CEO gets in their staff meeting. They're like, well, how are we doing on all of these 1,000,001 projects? And nobody dares tell the CEO, by the way, we can't get them all done. Like, we just do not have enough time to do all of this. Nobody says that. So the CEO doesn't realize that they're asking for like 80% more work than is capable for this set of humans. And so it just asks for status. What does every manager hear implicitly? I am not going to get promoted if I don't get my project done. And they don't even see the gestalt. So they go to their teams and they're like, hey, we got to get this project done. And by the way, I need to carefully look at who needs what vacation to make sure that we're not going to miss any of our deadlines. And all of a sudden, people aren't taking the time off. And so what the employee hears is that the CEO is lying to me. The CEO is saying they care about wellness, and the CEO doesn't care. And the CEO didn't write this rule. Did not say don't take vacation time. In fact, I had to go institute a rule, which was I would watch the vacation tracker, helped because I built it for the company. Don't ask why the head of security had built the vacation tracker, but I had. And I would literally had rules for minimums. That when we got to June, if you had not already taken or planned more than 50% of your allotted vacation for the year, I wanted to know why. Because at that point, you're way behind. Like, that isn't like 50% is where you should be. That's if you're not ahead of it, something's wrong because you haven't taken any in the first half. You haven't planned for the second half. What's going on? Like, I have to get involved. And the first time I did this, that's what I kind of heard was one of my managers had been telling people they couldn't take vacation time and that it was coming from me. And I'm sitting here going, it did not come from me. Time to go break this rule and tear it apart. And this is the sort of thing you have to watch for. It's the rules in your organization, which govern the LARP that is an organization. They're being written by people who honestly don't have the authority to bind as many people as they end up binding.
Some of it we don't even realize we're doing. It's all implicit.
Right. One of the things I discuss in I think it's chapter 2 of LARP Effect is exactly this point, that every organization is a LARP, just a badly designed one.
Yes.
Because roles are confused. What is actually my role? Well, I have this title, if I have a title at all, but this is what I'm doing every day. And why did these things go together? This is what the goals you say you want from my work, but these are the resources I'm being given to do it. And one of the important things about playing in a LARP that helps shift the mindset is people realize how much agency they have.
Yes. Because
LARPs don't run the same way every time. And one of the really fascinating things that has happened to me over and over is I will run a game and somebody will walk up to me at the end and say, well, this game was rigged. And I'm going, what do you mean rigged? Well, it could only have this one outcome and here's why. And they go through this whole thing and I'll say, well, this is the 8th time I've run it and the 8th different result that we got.
Yep.
But it looks inevitable in hindsight to the person who is sitting there having only seen it once.
Right.
So when people start to play in this and then they talk to other people and they hear all these different ways the same scenario played out, they start to realize they matter. Their actions actually do affect the outcome. And that's something that is very, very hard in our very complex world today, to feel like what you're doing makes a difference.
Mm-hmm. But oh no, it absolutely does. Like I've run into that where I ran the Buffy party game 3 times. Very different outcomes every single time it happened. One time we were pretty sure it was due to casting. We're like, oh, we cast the person who was the best shot at Buffy. Of course, Buffy won. But other times it completely went differently, and we were like, we just watched that. And I have to say, as a LARP game master, the hardest thing sometimes to do is when players find a place where you did not plan for. And sometimes you have to look and say, are they going to break the experience for everybody? And if so, I have to step in and help them get back onto the rails, but in a new way that I hadn't planned for. But if they're not going to break the experience for everyone, my job is to sit back and watch and learn from this one so that the next game I write is better written.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's exactly right.
Which comes to my next question. I think this was very good conversation. So when you're in a corporate environment, everybody's trying to impress the other person because they're trying to get their next promotion. How would you prep people to really get into role playing, because if you're with friends, you can do it easily, but if you're in a corporate environment with your peers, then you don't want to become so lighthearted, and what if you make a fool of yourself, or what if you expose yourself. So how would you prep a team so that they would relax and get into the LARP experience?
So when I do this, I'm putting them in a scenario that is nothing like The Office. It is most common one I use is a fairy tale game that my wife and I did, and it's up to 45 people, and you're all characters from fairy tales, somewhat twisted and mangled together, but you're characters from fairy tales. And by making such a clean break with day-to-day life at the office, it's much easier for people to take on the role, because it's not one person doing something silly. Everyone is doing something a little bit silly together. And that makes it much, much easier. And once people start talking to each other, they put on their little name badges and they start talking. Well, we're all doing it. And this is kind of the other side of the bystander effect, is when we see everyone doing something, we want to do it. And so we do. And we're already there. We've already walked into the room, and very few people will hang back. And when they do, that's its own learning experience. Actually, I did this game. My wife and I were out in California running this game for a group of rising college freshmen, and as part of an exercise to help them learn how to develop teamwork skills, because these are really smart kids. Most of them are going to MIT, but they were used to working on their own, not to being part of a team. So here they are. And one of them at the end of it said, well, when a whole bunch of people came and ganged up on me, I was thinking, where are my allies? And then I realized I never made any. I didn't build my team. And it wasn't there when he needed it. So it's that separation, it's that stepping outside that gives you the perspective, that lets you sort of get a much bigger perspective than what you're otherwise having to deal with every day.
Yeah, I think creating that separation is one of the important things, like the alibi of the role in the story and how different it feels. And that making that transition into that space is really important for how the game is facilitated and also how that transition is facilitated. And this is very clear. Like to the point that I mentioned earlier about how the game is facilitated really makes a difference. And there's a difference between, just LARPing for fun and LARPing for leadership in a corporate setting, which is, your question. Like it is different, and that requires a different facilitation skill set beyond, but also in my case, and I think others here, I've noticed that my facilitation skills as a leadership facilitator, creating the containers where people have permission to be vulnerable and to take off their hats a little bit and step into this space for today, and permission to play a little bit, and how we mark those transitions and help people get into that really makes a difference. And that's helped both my games and my coaching and facilitating to get people in it. And then the act of being vulnerable, or the act of role playing with each other or being silly with each other, is actually then the act that builds deeper psychological safety, which my research has found is in contradiction to what most people believe is I have to be safe first. Mm-hmm. Well, that's not the end of the story. You have to be safe enough to get started first. Mm-hmm. Then the real safety comes through actually having the role play experience together.
Yeah. Right. And then the other thing to really, because people do have a reputation, right? They don't get to completely disconnect and say, oh, what I did there, won't ever matter. No, it will actually matter. But that becomes your goal as a participant, is you get to say, what stories do I want people to tell about me? Because now I have the freedom that I don't have to be the wallflower who's waiting for permission. I get to go do a thing. I want to show off my skills. So you get to walk in as a participant with a set of goals that are about showcasing your abilities. And then you get a role and you're like, how does this role help support them? Maybe I don't get to showcase all the things I wanted to showcase, but I get to showcase some of them. I get to showcase that I'm a great connector, and I wish my boss could see that. Well, now my boss gets to see me doing this in a new light. And so that's really important is you're not there as you, but at the same time, you're going to carry your reputation forward. So you do want to make sure that you behave in a way that you will be happy with later. Like don't walk into a role-playing game and become a jerk to everybody and then try to tell everybody, oh, that was just the role I was playing.
Yes.
Because that might not go over so well. But at the same time, like you have great opportunities. And once you start doing that, you'll start to recognize you have those opportunities outside of role play as well. Like I have the stupidest little thing which I do in any facilitated session, which just includes like if I'm at a conference and a speaker is talking, right? I know that at the end of the talk, there is a chance the speaker will say, does anybody have any questions? And fellow speakers who are with me here, you know that this is a painful thing to do because 9 times out of 10, everybody's hand stays down. And now you're stuck. You ended your talk 10 minutes early to take questions from the crowd and nobody asks them, right?
Yeah.
I'm the guy who I'm sitting in the audience and I'm coming up with my question from the moment you start, and I'll come up with a question in your first 5 minutes, and then the next 5 minutes I'll be like, oh, I got a better one. Okay, I got a better one. And when you ask for a question, I wait 3 seconds. And if nobody else puts their hand up, my hand's up, I'll ask you the question. I'm not going to leave you hanging. Right? I am always the one to volunteer because that's the thing LARP taught me to do. Don't leave it hanging. LARP taught me that skill. And now people are always like, God, Andy, you always have brilliant questions. You're so smart. And I'm like, because I spent 50 minutes coming up with one. I wasn't trying to come up with one in 3 seconds. You just think I came up with it in 3 seconds. That's not smart. That's planning.
I will say, I will often, when I'll give a talk and, and when a hand finally goes up and someone asks a question, I will immediately, after answering their question, hand them a copy of whatever book I've most recently published, just to encourage
more of
people.
It. Yes. Yeah, no, I will often, when I'm giving a talk, I will either plant a question with one of the coordinators, or I'm like, I'll just run straight through. If there's, because unless somebody's got a question, I don't want to stop and then have us be in an awkward place.
But I wanted to just come back to something Joe had said about building safety. And I think it's a really important point. Safety and trust are not binary things. You've got them or you don't. They're things that we test. And this is all about social relationship. Is a constant test and response. Reaction validates the action. If I extend and make myself vulnerable and you respond by respecting that and sharing vulnerability of yourself, then I've been validated in my reaching out to you. And if I then respond appropriately, I validate your reaching back. And that's how we build the relationship. And again, what we're happening in role play, in LARP and in tabletop is we're getting to do this in an environment where if the reaction tells us, oh, this person isn't trustworthy, we haven't suffered any permanent harm.
Yeah.
And we've learned something about how the other person operates.
Because our original question about how do you prep for it, that conversation right there is one you should have with all the senior people, everybody who's a pay grade or more above the other people participating who will participate. They need to be told this is, look, this is how we build safety. The one way we do not build safety is by you saying, this is a safe space. Those are like the trigger words that every junior person is like, oh, I'm going to be very careful right now because I can never trust somebody who claims it's safe. You have to demonstrate this incremental safety. I really like the way you phrase that, of like, there's a little bit of safety. Okay, I'll risk. Okay, if I get more safety, I'll give more risk. And that's what people need to observe. And so when you're prepping, the senior staff should sort of all be given this, hey, your job here is not to take over. In fact, your job is to help everybody else be uplifted while still achieving your goals as well.
Right. And it's partly
even one of the things you touched upon, which was rules, because the people who don't want to participate, who don't want to let themselves, go with a LARP, and they're, concerned about how they'll be judged later, will find the rules as a sticky point, and they'll spend so much time arguing about the rules instead of playing the LARP. So I think in the prep, all those issues should be resolved early so that when they come in for the role play, then that's all they're doing. So, it's better to, just say, let's talk about all these issues early so that they don't come in the way of the actual LARP.
Well, that is definitely the case. And that's part of why starting a LARP always, at least for me, always involves going through the rules and taking questions.
Yep.
But frankly, the other piece of it, and this is where being a more experienced running games, whether tabletop or LARP, is learning when to listen politely and say, I hear your argument, and we're not going to go into that here. This is how it's working.
That's right.
There are just times when it's not the appropriate thing. There are times when someone has a valid question, then you have to address that. But if someone just wants to argue some obscure point, well, that's not what we're here for.
I totally agree. Fantastic. I think this was great. Does anyone want to give us some tips on if somebody wanted to book you or do a LARP training? What is the first step and why they should do it?
Well, the way to find me is www.sevenstepsahead.com. You can also go to larpeffect.sevenstepsahead.com, which will give information about LARP Effect and some of my speaking and the advantages of using LARP in training. And my contact information is all there. The reason for booking me is if you want your organization to actually perform as well as it is capable of when the pressure hits, well, the time to do that is before you need it, not when everything's falling apart.
Absolutely. And there you have the book as well. So tell us a little bit about the book that you're launching with how that's going to help organizations.
So what LARP Effect is doing is looking at how organizations are in many ways role play. They are a form of LARP, and how the lessons that we've learned from LARP really make a huge difference to building trust and safety, to goal setting, to understanding organizational change. That's one of the big ones, because when you start thinking of organizational change as a competition between stories, you start to realize why it's so hard to change even small things. Because stories tell us, as we've been talking about here, stories tell us how the world works. Stories tell us what to expect. And so when we come in and say, well, now we're going to do it this other way, what we're really doing is attacking people's sense of how the world works and what to expect. And that then attacks their sense of safety, because safety and trust are contextual. They exist within a framework and an environment. And it's like I practice martial arts. I have people I know, friends of mine, where I can go out and do jujitsu techniques with them that are potentially very, very dangerous, but I have confidence. I can trust that they will not try to hurt me. That doesn't mean I'm going to go and allow them to invest my money. Not because I think they'd be bad, that they're bad people, but because they haven't shown that they deserve to be trusted in that space. They have never shown any competence in that space. And I can lose my money myself that way, you know.
That's true. That's true. So you're watching Discover Brightside, and if you'd like to book a LARP training, then we'll make sure that information is available in the comment section. Write us a question, or if there's something that you want to know about, or if you have something interesting or a fact. We're going to do this panel again next month, and if you'd like to be on the show, just write us a comment and let us know. You're watching Discover Brightside, where we discover new things and new speakers for your next event. So thank you for watching.